September 20th, 1992. The Paramount Theater in Seattle. Pearl Jam was headlining what would become one of the most talked-about concerts in grunge history. The venue was packed beyond capacity. 15,000 bodies pressed together in the historic theater, the air thick with anticipation and cigarette smoke. This wasn't just another Pearl Jam show. This was Seattle reclaiming its sound, its identity, its place in rock history. Eddie Vedder stood at the microphone, sweat already beading on his forehead despite being only 3 songs into the set. The crowd was electric, feeding off the raw energy that only Pearl Jam could deliver. Behind him, Stone Gossard's guitar cut through the mix like a blade, while Jeff Amen's bass lines anchored the chaos. The band was midway through Alive when Eddie's eyes swept across the audience during the second verse. His voice carried the weight of the lyrics, that familiar anguish that had made Pearl Jam the voice of a generation. Then he saw him. In the back of the venue, barely visible in the dim lighting, stood a figure that made Eddie's voice catch mid-word. Blonde hair hanging limp over a face that had graced magazine covers worldwide, wearing a threadbare cardigan that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. Kurt Cobain. Eddie's voice faltered. The word alive died in his throat as his eyes locked onto the Nirvana frontman standing motionless in the crowd. Stone Gossard continued playing, unaware that something had shifted in the energy of the performance. Kurt wasn't moving, wasn't singing along, wasn't even acknowledging the music. He stood like a statue, his pale blue eyes fixed on Eddie with an expression that was impossible to read. Not hostile, not friendly, just present. The music continued for another few bars, but Eddie had stopped singing entirely. The crowd began to notice. 15,000 voices that had been singing along gradually fell silent as they realized their frontman was no longer with them. Stone Gossard finally looked over, concern creeping across his face. The guitar slowly faded as he followed Eddie's gaze toward the back of the venue. "I see you back there." Eddie's voice cut through the sudden quiet, amplified by the microphone, but somehow sounding smaller than usual. The crowd turned, necks craning, trying to figure out what their hero was looking at. Kurt didn't move, didn't acknowledge the attention. He simply stood there, a ghost in the machine of Seattle's music scene. "This next song," Eddie began, then stopped. His hands gripped the microphone stand until his knuckles went white. The silence stretched on, becoming uncomfortable, pregnant with tension that nobody in the venue understood. The rivalry between Pearl Jam and Nirvana was music industry folklore by 1992. Both bands had emerged from Seattle's underground scene. Both had achieved massive commercial success. Both were being hailed as the voice of Generation X. But where Nirvana's success felt accidental, almost reluctant, Pearl Jam had embraced their role as rock stars. Eddie Vedder could command a crowd, work them into a frenzy, make them feel like they were part of something bigger than themselves. Kurt Cobain, by contrast, seemed to resent every moment of his fame. His performances were often erratic, sometimes brilliant, sometimes barely coherent. He was the reluctant prophet of grunge, the man who had written the songs that defined a movement, but seemed to hate what that movement had become. The press loved to pit them against each other. Pearl Jam versus Nirvana, Eddie versus Kurt, corporate rock versus authentic rebellion. It was a narrative that sold magazines and generated controversy, but it was also a narrative that had created real tension between two artists who, at their core, were probably more similar than different. Eddie had never spoken publicly about Kurt. In interviews, he deflected questions about Nirvana with diplomatic non-answers. But privately, those close to him knew that the comparison stung, that being called less authentic than Kurt Cobain aided him. Now faced with Kurt's actual presence, Eddie seemed to be having some kind of internal crisis. "You know what?" Eddie said into the microphone, his voice gaining strength. "I was going to play Jeremy next, but I think we need to do something else." He turned to his bandmates, whispering something that the crowd couldn't hear. Stone looked confused. Jeff shrugged. Mike McCready, Pearl Jam's lead guitarist, simply nodded and adjusted his strap. Eddie turned back to the crowd. "This is something we've never played live before. Hell, we've barely played it at all. But sometimes you just have to be honest about where you are." The opening chords that came next were unlike anything Pearl Jam had ever performed publicly. slow, haunting, built around a simple acoustic progression that Stone played with trembling fingers. Eddie's voice, when it came in, was barely above a whisper. I'm still alive, but I'm barely breathing. Just praying to a God that I don't believe in, 'cause I got time while she got freedom, 'cause when a heart breaks, no, it don't break even. The song wasn't Jeremy. It wasn't alive. It was something raw and unfinished, something that sounded like it had been written in the darkness of a hotel room at 3 in the morning. The crowd was transfixed. This wasn't the Pearl Jam they knew. This wasn't the arena rock anthems or the grunge power chords. This was something vulnerable, something that stripped away all the pretense and left only the core of human emotion. Eddie's eyes never left Kurt's figure in the back of the venue. He sang like he was having a conversation with a ghost, like he was trying to communicate something that couldn't be said in normal speech. As the song continued, something extraordinary began to happen. The crowd, all 15,000 of them, began to sway in unison. Not dancing, not jumping, just feeling the music on a level that went beyond entertainment. Kurt, for the first time since Eddie had spotted him, moved, just slightly. His head tilted, as if he was hearing something in the music that surprised him. The song built slowly, adding layers of instrumentation, but never losing that intimate confessional quality. Eddie's voice grew stronger, more confident, but also more vulnerable. You're gonna catch a cold from the ice inside your soul, so don't come back for me. Who do you think you are? The words seemed to hang in the air, aimed directly at the figure in the back of the venue. Kurt's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, something that might have been recognition, or respect, or perhaps just surprise that Eddie Vedder, the golden boy of grunge, had shown him something real. As the song reached its climax, Eddie's voice cracked with emotion. This wasn't performance anymore. This was catharsis. This was 2 years of comparisons, criticism, and competition being poured out through a microphone in front of 15,000 strangers. When the last chord faded, the silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the usual crowd noise, the coughing, the shifting, the whispered conversations, had stopped completely. Eddie stood at the microphone, chest heaving, sweat streaming down his face. His eyes were still locked on the back of the venue, but Kurt was no longer there. Somehow in the darkness, he had vanished as quietly as he had appeared. The applause, when it finally came, was different from anything Pearl Jam had ever received. It wasn't the wild, ecstatic cheering of a rock concert. It was deeper, more respectful. The kind of applause reserved for moments when an artist reveals something true about themselves. Eddie wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and stepped back up to the microphone. Thank you, he said simply. Then after a long pause, that was for everyone who's ever felt like they didn't belong where they ended up. The rest of the concert was electric, but in a different way than before. The energy was more focused, more genuine. Eddie performed like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, like he had finally said something that needed to be said. After the show, backstage, the band was quiet. They had all felt it. That moment when the performance had shifted from entertainment to something more profound. What was that song? Stone asked finally. Eddie was sitting on a folding chair, his head in his hands. Something I've been working on for months, something I never thought I'd have the courage to play. Who were you looking at out there? Jeff wanted to know. You were singing to someone specific. Eddie looked up, his eyes still red from the emotion of the performance. Kurt was here. Kurt Cobain. He was watching from the back. The room fell silent. Did you talk to him? Mike asked. Eddie shook his head. He was gone before I could. But I think maybe we didn't need to talk. Word of the concert spread quickly through Seattle's tight-knit music community. People who had been there called friends who hadn't, trying to describe what they had witnessed. Music journalists who had attended began writing pieces about the night Pearl Jam stripped away all pretense and revealed something raw and honest. But the most significant response came 3 weeks later. Eddie was at home, reading a book, when his phone rang. The voice on the other end was quiet, hesitant. Eddie, this is Kurt Cobain. Eddie nearly dropped the phone. Kurt, hi. I didn't expect to hear from you. I was at your show, at the Paramount. I know, I saw you. There was a long pause. When Kurt spoke again, his voice was even quieter. That song you played, the one you'd never done before, what was it called? Eddie thought for a moment. He'd been working on it for months, but had never given it a title. I don't know yet. Maybe Break Even. Or just Barely Breathing. It was beautiful, Kurt said. It was honest. Another silence. I've been thinking about what you said, about not belonging where you ended up. Yeah, I feel that way every day. Like I accidentally became this thing that I never wanted to be. Like the music got away from me somewhere along the way. Eddie found himself nodding, even though Kurt couldn't see him. I know what you mean. Sometimes I feel like I'm performing my life instead of living it. That's exactly it, Kurt said, and for the first time there was something like excitement in his voice. That's exactly it. They talked for 2 hours, about music, about fame, about the weight of being called the voice of a generation when you weren't sure you had anything meaningful to say, about the loneliness of being surrounded by thousands of people who knew your songs but not your name. When they finally hung up, both men felt something they hadn't experienced in months, understood. The song Eddie had debuted that night at the Paramount was never officially recorded by Pearl Jam, but bootleg recordings of the performance circulated in trading circles for years, becoming one of the most sought-after recordings in grunge history. Music critics would later cite that performance as a turning point in Pearl Jam's career, the moment when Eddie Vedder stopped trying to be a rock star and started being an artist. Kurt would reference the conversation they had afterward in several interviews, calling it one of the most meaningful exchanges he'd had with another musician. Years later, after Kurt's death, Eddie would dedicate Pearl Jam's performance of Alive to his memory, telling the crowd, "This is for someone who reminded me that it's okay to not know where you belong, as long as you keep looking for home." The night Eddie Vedder stopped mid-song because he saw Kurt Cobain in the audience became the stuff of Seattle music legend. Not because of what was said, but because of what was felt. Two artists, at the height of their fame, finding a moment of genuine human connection in the middle of all the noise. It was a reminder that behind all the mythology, the rivalry, and the press coverage, music is ultimately about people trying to communicate something true about what it feels like to be alive. And sometimes, if you're brave enough to strip away all the pretense, someone else might hear you and understand that they're not alone in feeling lost in their own success. The concert ended at 11:47 p.m. By midnight, both Eddie Vedder and Kurt Cobain were driving home through the quiet streets of Seattle, both carrying the weight of a moment that had changed how they understood their place in the world. Neither of them knew it at the time, but they had just participated in one of the most honest exchanges in rock history, a moment when two rival artists stopped competing and started connecting. It was exactly the kind of thing that made Seattle's music scene special, and exactly the kind of thing that would be remembered long after the last grunge song faded from the radio. The ripple effects of that night extended far beyond the two musicians involved. Members of other Seattle bands who had been in the audience that night began incorporating more vulnerable, stripped-down moments into their own performances. The idea that authenticity could be more powerful than technical perfection began to reshape how grunge artists approach their craft. Stone Gossard would later say in interviews that the Paramount show marked the beginning of Pearl Jam's most creative period. Eddie stopped trying to prove he belonged and started just being himself. The music got better immediately. Jeff Ament noticed the change too. Before that night, there was always this tension in Eddie, like he was carrying around this weight of expectation. After the Kurt thing, after that phone call, it was like he finally gave himself permission to be human on stage. The song that Eddie had premiered that night, the one he'd sung directly to Kurt's ghost-like presence in the crowd, eventually evolved into material for Pearl Jam's next album. But it was never the same as that raw, unrehearsed version from the Paramount. Some things the band learned were meant to exist in only one moment, for only one audience. Kurt, for his part, began referencing that night obliquely in Nirvana's subsequent interviews. When asked about the Seattle music scene, he would sometimes mention this moment when you realize that everyone else is just as lost as you are, and that's actually okay. The music press tried to make a story out of the phone call between Eddie and Kurt, but neither musician was willing to provide details. They kept that conversation sacred, understanding that some connections were too fragile to survive public scrutiny. In the months that followed, both bands seemed to ease up on the rivalry that had been manufactured around them. When asked about Pearl Jam in interviews, Kurt would shrug and say, "They're good people making good music." When asked about Nirvana, Eddie would nod and say, "Kurt gets it in a way that most people don't." The concert bootleg, when it finally surfaced in trading circles, was often titled "The Night Eddie Met Kurt" or "Barely Breathing Paramount 92." It became essential listening for serious grunge collectors, not just for the rarity of the song, but for the raw emotion captured in that moment when an artist strips away all pretense. Music historians would later point to September 20th, 1992, as a pivot point in the relationship between Seattle's two biggest bands. Before that night, Pearl Jam and Nirvana existed in a state of manufactured competition. After that night, they existed as two different expressions of the same basic human need to be understood. The tragedy of Kurt's death in 1994 gave that night at the Paramount an even deeper resonance. Eddie's dedication of "Alive" to Kurt's memory wasn't just about honoring a fallen peer. It was about remembering a moment when two artists found each other across the noise of fame and industry expectation. In the end, the story of Eddie Vedder stopping mid-song when he saw Kurt Cobain in the audience became more than just a piece of music history. It became a reminder that authentic connection is possible, even in the middle of the most artificial circumstances. That two people can recognize something true in each other, even when the whole world is trying to make them enemies. The 15,000 people who were in the Paramount Theater that night witnessed something that couldn't be replicated, couldn't be planned, and couldn't be sold. They saw two human beings acknowledge each other's existence in the most honest way they knew how, through music that came from somewhere deeper than technique or ambition, and in a music scene that would soon be consumed by corporate interest in media manipulation. That moment of genuine recognition became a touchstone for what Seattle grunge had been at its best. A community of artists who understood that being vulnerable in public was the highest form of courage, and that connection was more important than competition.